Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be, I say, back in Budapest, because this is my 5th or 6th visit here, I think, and in such a lovely building too. It's very beautiful. So my title, the title I've given to this talk, is A Christian Country, ? Reflections on the Role of Christianity in Contemporary Public Life. David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, caused a minor stir over Easter this year when he declared that Britain is a Christian country. Predictably enough, this provoked a reaction from the ever vociferous secularist lobby, to which some religiously minded people were moved to reply. Figures were bandied about: low church attendance on the secular side, on the other, high numbers of what might charitably be called non-professing Christians, who nevertheless declare themselves religious or even Christian in opinion surveys. Those supporting Mr. Cameron pointed to the Christian roots of British life and institution, while the secularists claimed that this sort of talk, while not untrue, tended to marginalize people of other faiths or of none, as the phrase goes. What was perhaps remarkable about all of this was that there was, in fact, very little disagreement in matters of fact on the part of the various sides. Neither figures nor history were seriously questioned, at most nuances of interpretation. So is there more at stake here than a degree of posturing and noise? Clearly, if one looks at contemporary British society with a dispassionate eye, it would be hard to say that it is in any deep sense Christian. It is not only that church attendance is low. Generally speaking, attitudes in many areas of life, public and private, are not in any serious sense Christian. Indeed, if the worlds of the intellect, the media, and entertainment were taken as representative, one might conclude that Britain is more anti-Christian than Christian, and certainly non-Christian. But beneath the somewhat ambiguous and inconclusive discussion of contemporary Britain's religiousness, there is something which is worrying, at least for those concerned with the treatment of minorities. It is perhaps symbolized in the phrase I've already alluded to, people of no faith. People of no faith, that is, secularists, are increasingly arguing that anything with a hint of faith should not be tolerated in the public sphere. So religious beliefs, however deeply and sincerely held, and whether Christian or not, should not be allowed to intrude in medical practice, in voluntary adoption agencies should be closed rather than restrict their placements to heterosexual couples. And there is increasing pressure against the very existence of what are called faith, that is, religious schools, which are now, for example, being pressured to teach what has become the official state line on so-called gay rights. And I just mentioned that last week in the Sunday Times, I picked up the paper to read, "Faith schools must teach gay rights." That's being promulgated by the supposedly conservative government. What's ironic about this is that this all started with an inquiry by the school inspectorate into into actual Islamic extremism in schools, but it's quickly been turned by the authorities into an attack on people of faith propounding traditional views on homosexuality, which is just the way things go in this sort of area. I don't know if this is what's the case in Hungary, but this is the way things are going in Britain. Now, what's overlooked in much of this is that Christians and people of other faiths, including Muslims, of course, pay their taxes and are as much citizens as people of no faith. And so long as their practices are not clearly oppressive or objectionable, for example, by forcing underage girls to marry or undergo genital mutilation, by promoting terrorism, or by actually preventing those who disagree from pursuing their own legitimate ends, they should not be outlawed or rendered impossible by government diktat. But Christian schools are not preventing secularists from having non-religious schools, nor are Christian adoption agencies preventing homosexual adoptions among those who favour them, nor, whatever might have been the case in the 16th century, do Catholic schools in England now foster allegiance to Spain. Nor, if this is a genuine concern, would most Christians favour schools in which the theory of evolution is seriously questioned. There are, of course, tricky questions on the borderline, so to speak. I'm thinking here of committed Jehovah's Witnesses attempting to prevent their children from having life-saving blood transfusions, which is the subject of a recent novel by Ian McEwan called The Children Act. For what it's worth, I think that I am on the side of the secularists here. It really is a direct matter of life and death, and the life is of one to whom the state might be thought to owe a duty of paternalism, like the Muslim girls being mutilated by their families. But unlike some of the more intransigent and noisy secularists, I am not saying that the question of its resolution is easy. From a secularist perspective, or at least from the point of view of those who want to resist any taint of Christianity in law or politics, the public sphere should be governed and regulated by principles which can, in theory, be adduced without any antecedent commitments and as determined by what will be called democratic procedures. But the principles which can be determined without antecedent commitments may not be quite what they seem. As we see with abortion and gay rights, they turn out, by coincidence I'm sure, to be just those which the secularists agree to, overlooking the fact that their views on rights, obligations, freedoms, and the rest rely on assumptions which are by no means self-evident, as 200 or more years of philosophical effort to show them as such might suggest. My point here is that a secularist morality, and what it might allow or forbid, is by no means self-evident or unquestionable, and secularists are misleading if they imply that their morality is simply self-standing and obvious to any purely rational person. I'm reminded of Nietzsche's coruscating criticism of Kant, whom he called the catastrophic spider, and who Nietzsche argued should not have the right to dictate from his own reason what everybody else should do. And I mean, I think that is a powerful argument against Kant. Not that I'm a Nietzschean, but I think Nietzsche is pointing to a fundamental, not weakness, but you know, these things, as I say, are by no means self-evident. By no means self-evident. Moreover, appeal to democratic mandate here is somewhat disingenuous, as anyone who has had anything to do with formulation of policies on education or with the reform of the law in morally contested areas will, if they are honest, admit. As Baroness Mary Warnock, an astute philosopher as well as a legislator, once revealed, in practice, legislation about matters in which there are strong moral disagreements is determined not so much by concepts of right and wrong as by what civil servants judge public opinion might find, quote, acceptable. She says that what she learned from arguments about in vitro fertilization when in 1982 she chaired the British Human Embryology and Fertilization Committee, in which she recommended permitting research on embryos for up to 14 days, what she learned from that, she says, was that there was a difference between a moral principle that was generally agreed, for example, that children should not be used as subjects of research, and one that was, quote, acceptable. She says that she initially found this mealy-mouthed civil servant speak, as it did not commit one to anything definite, like right and wrong. But, she says, she came to see her sensitivity here as confusing public and private morality. In public morality, we work through stages that people can, quote, live with, that is, compromises between more extreme positions. In this case, the 14-day rule for IVF, she says, blocked the slippery slope argument of the sacredness of life people while allowing something to those who advocated research wholeheartedly. She says that what she proposed still allowed conscientious objectors to opt out while leaving the door open for pressure for further reform. And I think, well, I'm going to say a bit more about it. I mean, this is actually strikingly honest about how things actually work in public policy. In fact, it is doubtful that she did actually block the slippery slope argument. She and her committee had drawn a line after which experimentation on embryos was not permitted, true, but experimentation on embryos was now permitted rather than being ruled out of court. It was no longer a question of no, as opposed to a question of when, which is precisely the slide identified by the slippery slope argument. Today's not now so easily becomes tomorrow's okay. Remember Dolly the sheep and cloning, when Ian Wilmot and the scientists originally involved assured us that there was no possibility of cloning being done in the human sphere. Therapeutic cloning is now upon us, and not necessarily a bad thing, but that was not what we were assured would be the case in the 1980s. And in the atmosphere of what might be called evolving, but not necessarily improving standards, conscientious objections are increasingly outlawed. That is to say, pressure is put on people and agencies to conform to the new state of things, unable to opt out on grounds of conscience. I don't know, for example, how easy it is in practice for nurses in gynecology wards to opt out of termination procedures, even if technically they have the right to do so. Significantly in this context, the British Nursing and Midwifery Council advises nurses to give, quote, careful consideration before accepting a post in a unit where there may be questions of conscience, and in any case to be, quote, non-judgmental at all times, facilitate patient access to such procedures, etc., etc. And has been made quite clear recently in British courts, evangelical Christians who own guest houses or hotels are now obliged by law to allow cohabiting homosexuals to rent rooms together in their establishments or to have their establishments closed by the police. Incidentally, Warnock said in her book that she was opposed to any relaxation of the law on euthanasia, and her book, I think, came out in 1998, because she then saw no simple way of blocking a slippery slope to the unacceptable killing of the old. But she's changed her mind on that. Now she argues that old people should, in certain circumstances, be helped to die, and even that there should be a license to put down those with dementia who are wasting the resources of the National Health Service. Here, as in many similar areas, what was not so long ago unthinkable, for example, cloning in humans, putting down the demented, becomes very thinkable very quickly. Now, somewhat similar to Warnock's pragmatic position on acceptability is Cass Sunstein's objection to the 1997 philosopher's brief to the US Supreme Court, signed by John Rawls, the distinguished moral philosopher I'm going to talk about in a minute, among others. This philosopher's brief advocated physician-assisted suicide in 1997, but Sunstein objected to this because he thought that at that time such a thing might be counterproductive. Rawls later admitted that Sunstein might have had a point, that, as Sunstein argued, things would have gone better had the court let the debate play out a bit. Rawls was thus clearly open to a pragmatic argument like Sunstein's, and in effect like Warnock's position. But wherever we come down on that, Rawls is also emphatic that in public deliberation on such issues, people give the kinds of reasons that can be understood and appraised, as he puts it, apart from particular comprehensive doctrines, and that they do not object to physician-assisted suicide by, quote, speculating about God's wrath or the afterlife. Rawls distinguishes in his philosophy between what he speaks of as comprehensive doctrines, which cover the whole of life and are in a certain sense private and personal, and considerations which satisfy what he calls the criterion of reciprocity, that is, what would be seen as reasonable by everyone. He admits that what he says here is primarily procedural, how we should proceed in such matters, and not appealing to comprehensive doctrines, even secular ones, like those of Mill and Kant. Even though people can, according to Rawls, introduce comprehensive considerations into their arguments, what the arguments should really rest on are the kinds of reasons that, quote, all members of a society might reasonably agree to, not that they necessarily would agree to, which is surely a telling concession. As in the case of capital punishment, immigration, and gay marriage, what Rawls probably thinks that all members of a society might reasonably agree to is not what they actually would agree to if there were a vote on them tomorrow. Rawls adds that public reason isn't about the right answers to these types of questions, but about the kinds of reasons that ought to be admitted in making policy decisions and the law. But even if it's not explicit in Rawls' words, it is clear that this way of proceeding is implicitly relativistic. It is about reasons that all members of a society might reasonably agree to, at some particular time, presumably. It is what people in a particular society at a particular time might reasonably agree to, not all people at all times. And this is clearly going to vary as the moral standards prevailing in a society at any given time change or evolve, which they clearly do. But many of us, and particularly, though not exclusively religious people, would not see things like that. In the logic of moral discourse, we see our standards as, ideally anyway, timeless and true. There is indeed obviously some uneasiness on Rawls' part here, for he does not speak about what would actually be agreed, but about reasons that might be agreed to reasonably, but won't necessarily be so. Who, one wonders, is to decide that? Rawls was no doubt uncomfortably aware, as a good American liberal, that acceptability to public opinion is not necessarily what the majority would actually vote for were they given the chance, which of course they rarely are in these matters. My own sense here is that if one is concerned with liberty, it will be wise to resist acceptability to public opinion as a criterion of genuine acceptability, especially where, as is increasingly the case, doing so is likely to involve imposing interference and compulsion on the freedoms and rights of others. Rawls's procedural secularism seems at this point decidedly murky and slippery, hard to defend philosophically or politically. Now, I think that we should move on to a different ground at this point and consider what would ideally happen in a society broadly committed to upholding and defending liberal values, classical liberal values. Liberal in the sense of freedom promoting and respectful of individual choice. My suggestion is that in such a society, within certain limits, the protection of the rights and freedoms of law-abiding minorities ought to lead legislators to seek, as far as possible, to respect their sensibilities rather than trample on them. I also want to insist at this point that liberty is, for me, more important than democracy. I realize that in a Hungarian context, this is a rather tricky issue at the moment. At least, even if democracy is the best way of enhancing liberty, and I stress if, democracies are by no means guaranteed to be liberal in the sense I am advocating and defending. They can, and often do, trample on the rights of minorities and individuals to lead their lives, as they, rather than the majority, even where it really is a majority, or the state, sees fit. So people concerned to preserve their religious liberty to lead their lives as they see fit should begin to campaign on the liberal/libertarian side, and indeed be prepared to disestablish the church or churches, even if this has not been the position always taken by religious people. But I think that it should have been all along, as I will attempt shortly to show. It would also be in line with the more general classical liberal view that the function of the state should not be to impose its or anyone's own comprehensive view on life and how it should be lived, but should rather hold the ring so that differing and even competing views could flourish and compete alongside each other. To an extent, and somewhat to my surprise, I find myself at this crucial point in the argument in agreement with Rawls, who pointed out in an interview in 1988 that the United States First Amendment was passed precisely because Baptists and Presbyterians teamed up with Madison to get Jefferson's bill through. They actually hated Jefferson, but they objected even more to the attempts at establishment by the Congregationalists, who were established in New England and in some of the southern states, and were already trying to exclude Baptists and Presbyterians. The First Amendment, as I'm sure you know, bars the establishment of any religion, but also the impeding of the free exercise of any religion. And that is what I think we should be aiming at in 2014. What I am presenting as a conflation of a Christian and classical liberal dispensation would naturally be unacceptable to many Muslims who demand a theocratic regime with Sharia law, very much based on a comprehensive doctrine and discriminating against non-Muslims in all sorts of ways, as we see in contemporary Pakistan, Iran, and many other places. As I am speaking here from a basically liberal point of view, I am quite prepared to campaign against and even to legislate against those who would seek to undermine our liberties on whatever grounds, and even more against those who would use our regimes of tolerance to promote intolerance and worse. I have sympathy with Rawls at this point, and none with Muslims who would introduce Sharia law and courts into liberal societies, and actually are already doing so in Britain. But also, I have little sympathy with the 18th century Congregationalists, or with other advocates of religious establishments, such as the popes who were secular rulers in the Middle Ages and subsequently. To come close to our own time and to my home, I have no sympathy whatever with De Valera's Ireland, being in no doubt that the disgraceful abuse that went on in Catholic institutions in Eire was abetted by the theocratic nature of that state and its agencies, police, judiciary, etc., let alone prosecution of those cruel abuses perpetrated under the mantle of Catholic charity and morality, virtually unthinkable. And in this, I think I can draw on a venerable and defensible Christian tradition, which wasn't really alive in Eire at the time, which may even be said to have its roots in Augustine's City of God, and even allowing for the fact that in many societies, the state and the secular state in particular will have laws and allow practices which Christians will have a moral duty to object to and even resist in legal ways. Thus, the religious perspective, being transcendent and appealing to a divine and timeless authority, will provide a yardstick by which other institutions, regimes, and customs can be judged. Christ's authority is not of this world, and because it's not of this world, but of a higher authority altogether, it stands in judgment over this world. In particular, it will judge the actions of secular states unfavorably if these are seen as compromising or undermining the sacredness of the individual, if the state in any way seems to be seriously abusing individuals for its own ends. From the point of view of Christianity, it is never expedient that one man dies for the people. So is it ever expedient that one terrorist is tortured or sent back to where he is likely to be tortured? Is it ever expedient that an old person is quietly and gently disposed of, or a disabled fetus aborted, or embryos produced, manufactured indeed, for research? Obviously, these areas will be of central importance to religious moralists and may well bring them into disagreement with the prevailing public ethic of utilitarianism and the prevailing politics of administrative convenience. Conflict of this sort should not seem surprising when one reflects just how demanding the idea of the sacredness of the individual really is. Nor should we be shocked that others find this ethic inconvenient. What would be more shocking would be a religious collapse in the face of contrary public opinion, or perhaps better, in the face of the convenient pragmatism so easily favoured by legislators and bureaucrats. Though what, in a secular pluralist state, not collapsing might entail is not always easy to determine. Given that we are in a liberal state, though, in which part of the ground rule, so to speak, is that people are permitted to live out their lives in different ways as they see fit, religious non-collapsing in the face of secularists who disagree should not involve violent or direct action, such as bombing abortion clinics, even if religious people think abortion is wholly wrong. This is because living in a free society, as well as affording all of us the freedoms it does, as part of its as well as affording us all of us freedoms, does, as part of its dispensation, part of the social contract, if you like, impose restrictions on what individuals can do to others in their society, even for what might seem the best and most morally urgent of reasons. On the other hand, I am not at all clear what someone wholly opposed to embryo research on religious grounds should do if he or she were invited to go on to Mary Warnock's Human Embryology and Fertilization Authority. Unlikely, I admit, and liable to happen only through some oversight on the part of the appointers. But if it did happen, should it be seen by that individual as a chance to prevent some harm, or rather as collusion in what, from their point of view, should not be given any support or credibility at all? But this is a practical question, which does not impinge on the right and duty of the Church, as it would see it, to speak out clearly against what it believes to be seriously wrong. But speaking out is not the same as legislating so as to curtail the freedoms of others and their rights to act on their consciences, and even less would it sanction extra-legal violence against those with whom one disagrees, even for the most sacred of reasons. The point I'm making here may well have some foreshadowing in Augustine's doctrine of the two cities, as I've already intimated. The city of God is not of this earth, and will not be found in its pure form short of the Last Judgment. It may defeasibly be identified with those currently en route for eternal glory, as the Church militant, but in all actual human institutions, including the Church itself, there is an inextricable mingling of the elect and the reprobate, of the two cities, in other words. In this life, due particularly to the corruption of human nature after the fall, there is need for a political state in order to establish the conditions of relative peace and security in which individuals should work out their salvation or otherwise. But the state cannot or should not actually legislate or coerce so as to promote the salvation of individuals, or even to enforce a narrowly Christian view of morality where this goes beyond keeping the peace. I am here in some agreement with Rawls on the conditions legitimate in legislating, though I would base them not on any secularist dispensation seeking to outlaw appeal to comprehensive doctrines of life, but rather on the basic structural requirements of a liberal and tolerant society. Interestingly, from a Christian and historical point of view, I've come to see elements of what I'm arguing in Dante. It was interesting to me anyway, in which the poet's changing attitude to the Guelphs and Ghibellines of his time, I think, reflect what I'm arguing. The Guelphs were the party in Italy and in Florence who were broadly in favour of the papacy and its power, while the Ghibellines favoured the establishment in Italy of rule by the emperor. Dante, as a Florentine leader, was initially a Guelph, but it is fair to say that his experiences, nasty experiences, in Rome and Florence, and then in exile, convinced him that a powerful political papacy would inevitably suffer from all the defects I've been sketching above. Not for nothing are a number of popes, including his arch-enemy and contemporary Pope Boniface VIII consigned to hell, precisely because they used the papacy and its power as if it were a secular princedom. But secular power, which is bound to corrupt the church and compromise its mission if it's entwined with the church, does have a positive role to play in stopping wars and ameliorating discord and crime, and could do so under a wise and powerful sovereign. I would add that the secular state also has a crucial role in ensuring tolerance and mutual freedoms within its domain. It was because Dante had hopes that Italy might fall under what he believed might be the beneficent rule of the putative Emperor Henry VII of Luxembourg that he moved towards the Ghibelline cause after his exile from Florence. These hopes were dashed with Henry's death, but Dante's own experiences allowed him to develop in the Divine Comedy a picture of the clear separation of the roles of church and state, the church being concerned with salvation only, and the state with providing the conditions of peace and security which we and the church all need in our journey through this world. In this journey, the church may well have a duty to be critical of the state and of the moral stances of others, but certainly in a pluralist, liberal society, it must see itself as existing as one voice among others, whose space and principles must also be respected in the public sphere. Actually, there was nothing very new in Dante's political vision. Writing on the papal reforms instigated by Hildebrand Gregory VII in the 11th century, in which there was an attempt to sever the close relationships which then existed between church and state, the historian Reginald Lade Poole wrote in 1884, "It is perfectly clear that if the church was to exercise the sway which all Christians agreed it ought to exercise over the consciences of men, it must be as free as possible from those ties which bound it to the secular state." Further, as Gregory, quite rightly, regarded civil government as a human institution deeply polluted by its sinful origin, there could be no preferred type of regime, such as monarchy, for example, so much for the divine right of kings. Indeed, granted only the superiority of ecclesiastical power, there was no concession that the church would not make in favor of popular rights. And we find in the writings of Manigold of Lautenbach, a follower of Hildebrand in the 11th century, as eloquent a statement of the theory of the social contract as any of the 17th and 18th centuries. To return from this historical digression, though, to my initial unease with the aggressively strident secularism with which I began this lecture, I was thinking there of attacks on what are called faith schools, whether Christian or Muslim, and also of the British government's use of charity and equality legislation to corral the activities of religious charities, such as adoption agencies, into its own vision, that is, the state's vision of the good life, what I think is an illiberal and secularist comprehensive view of the good life, to put it bluntly. And I'll make a few brief remarks on these examples in conclusion, so as to explore what seem to me to be the implications of what I've been arguing thus far. To take the question of faith schools first. At the most general level, the question raised here is that of the responsibility for the education of children. Where does this principally lie? In the hands of parents, or is it vested in the state? And I would follow Mill here in On Liberty, chapter 5, in agreeing that the state has a duty to ensure that education actually takes place, while insisting that the responsibility for carrying out and directing that education ought to be that of the parents who brought their children into the world. Like Mill, one could argue on liberal grounds that, quote, "a general state education would be a mere contrivance for moulding people to be exactly like one another, and that in proportion as it is efficient and successful, it would establish a despotism over the mind, leading by natural tendency to one over the body." And if you think that's exaggerated, you should come to England and examine the operations of the national curriculum, and also not in the national curriculum, but the fact that you can hardly a day goes by without some edict coming down from the Department of Education, sponsored by a celebrity chef, on what children are or aren't allowed to eat in schools. I don't know whether that even happened in communist days here. To take the question of faith schools, it would be inappropriate, well, I've just done it actually, it would be inappropriate to go here into detail in any of these matters. So I will simply record my impression that as the state in Britain has directed and regulated education more and more, particularly since it nationalised the curriculum and exams 20 years ago, what Mill says has been largely borne out in experience. The state, let's be blunt, clearly has no monopoly of wisdom, or even, you might think, no wisdom at all on educational matters, which is Mill's point. And one could add to Mill's refreshing pluralism here the more specifically religious conviction, which I share, that children do not belong to the state and its agencies. And I would further add that if the state insists on funding education in such a way as to put private education out of the hands of the vast majority of the population, 93% in the case of England, then it will have to countenance not just the existence of religious schools and schools of all other kinds and sorts, it will have to fund them too, if there is parental demand. After all, the families of Catholics, Mormons, Muslims, and Scientologists all pay taxes just as much as the families of agnostics, atheists, and secularists. What though if some of these schools teach Islam or creationism, whatever that means? I'm inclined to ask simply, what if they do? And leave it at that, uncomfortable as it would no doubt be to many. Just how deep does our liberal pluralism go? Actually, and this is what does concern me, not very far, it seems, given that state-sponsored attempts we're seeing in Britain, and elsewhere no doubt, to circumscribe religious practice and teaching, even in faith schools, often in the name of equality legislation. Of course, I do accept that there are limits to what is tolerable, and especially to what is tolerable in a liberal society, given what I said earlier about mutual tolerance. So if a school was manifestly abusing children physically or psychologically as part of a supposed religious ritual, or urging its pupils to train as terrorists, which seems to have been happening in Birmingham, then action should be taken swiftly and firmly. But teaching that Islam is the only true religion and that ideally its remit should include the political, or that gay marriage is questionable, or even that the world began a mere 10,000 years ago, hardly fall into these categories. Do teaching these things in schools, in any uncontentious sense, amount to abuse? Again, these are difficult matters requiring patient examination and not knee-jerk condemnation. Maybe teaching six-day creationism in a school could be seen as an abuse of power on the part of the school. But rather than the state issuing lists of doctrines proscribed in all schools, it seems to me that we would do better just to accept that there may, at the margins, be degrees of irresolvable conflict here between religion and the prevailing ethos, which seems to hold not just that science is true, but also that the teaching of scientific truth as the only truth is so important as to trump all other considerations. Actually, I suspect that with mutual goodwill, all sorts of reasonable compromises are possible in this area, and that they will, in the main, be made. After all, children of creationist parents will mostly do public exams in science, where evolution is taught. And there are plenty of Muslims prepared to live under the Dar al-Harb and to engage in its political processes. And many, if not most, critics of gay marriage are perfectly tolerant of homosexuality and civil partnerships. So the discomforts which some of us might feel in the area of schooling can in the main be ameliorated. But where compromises do not seem to be possible, a genuinely pluralist liberal society ought, as far as possible, to act permissively towards religious dissidents, just as I argued earlier that religious people should act permissively towards the existence of abortion clinics. On the question of whether Christian adoption agencies should be forced to accept homosexual couples as prospective adopters, the situation seems to me to be much clearer. The state is simply abusing its power in forcing religious people either to act against their principles or not at all, where what they want to do compromises no one's freedom. After all, homosexuals are not being barred from adopting through non-religious agencies. So if it is a question of equality, that has already been secured. But I think that actually the case sets a wider and worrying precedent, in that in it the state is using the law, in this case equality law, to enforce a code of ethics which is in itself contentious and which goes too far beyond reflecting any general consensus on what is required for us as a society to live together to be a justifiable basis for legislation. Throughout this lecture, I've defended a pluralist view of society and a political organization in which religion certainly has a role to play, but one distinct from that of the secular power or sovereign. Anticipations of this view may be found in the Middle Ages, as I've just suggested, though of course neither Hildebrand nor Dante had their visions realized, or not for any length of time. It would, though, be fascinating to think that the limited pluralist state of Western democracy, which is the perspective from which I've been writing, is itself in some ways a descendant of a powerful strain of medieval Christian thinking, that represented by Hildebrand, Manigault, Dante, and possibly even Augustine, at least in the limited role that strain accords to religion in the political realm. And given this, and given the contemporary examples I've just been looking at, it would not be unfitting if in these post-religious days, religion itself became an advocate of the classical liberal state and of its proper limits. Whatever may have been its stance in the past, religion should come now to shelter under the umbrella of the classical liberal state in order to claim the right to practice and pass on its own beliefs. What, though, is ironical in all of this is that despite David Cameron's protestations that Britain is a Christian country, the government which he leads has, to put it mildly, done little to preserve within the public sphere a space for those with Christian sensibilities, or even to protect a million sense of liberty.
Thank you very much indeed. And now I'm going to invite that I thought was an extraordinarily rich and interesting lecture, and I'm looking forward to the debate that ensues. May I invite Ferenc Horscher, a distinguished academic at the university, to respond. We are now going to turn the floor over to you in a moment. While you're formulating precisely your questions, may I just ask Kalman that, for some technical advice here, and that is the use of the microphone. Are we using this microphone throughout? And is there a roving microphone? Oh, thank you, yes. Well, I'm going to ask you to put the questions, when you put a question, to say who you are and where appropriate, the institution you're with. Would you say whom you're directing the question to? Although, by the way, I think it will be open to both speakers to respond to any question if they wish. And let me take the first question.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Andre, good friend, representing myself, but the charge d'affaires at the American Embassy. And so I'll represent an American perspective. You were describing primarily, I think, your European perspectives with regards to, or non-US perspectives with regards to the role of the state and religion within the state. Whether the state is self-described as being, as having a religion, being a Christian state, or being a Muslim state, or being a Jewish state, states that identify themselves, regardless of the religiosity of their citizens, as being characterized by a religion, which is different than the United States, which generally is characterized by having a very religious people, at least as seen by other countries. Certainly the view in Europe is Americans are seen as very religious, but the state itself is separate from, it separates itself from religion. This distinction, where in the United States we've created a framework in which the different communities, the different religious communities can exist without having to fight for support of the state, or not have the state call itself a Christian country or a Jewish country or a Muslim country or Buddhist country, but call itself not a secularist country. It's not secularism, but a state which is independent of religion, in which the religious communities are able to exist and not be supported by the state. How does you've alluded to the U.S. context sometimes particularly within the response, but how does this framework, where a state specifically says that that the church and state are separate, that one renders unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God, and they are not combined, and it's not the role of the state to attach itself to a religion. How does this fit within the framework that you've been describing?
I think that the United States is as close in this respect to the ideal as I believe has happened in history. I think that the dispensation within the states, United States, of a religious people, and I think that is an important point. And of course, it's something that Europeans, as you've implied, find it very hard to come to terms with. And it's their lack that they just do not understand this, because all they hear is the more secularist voices from the United States. However, I think that you can have, the United States shows that you can have a civil society which is not the same as the state, and ideally a more limited state than is common in Europe, which tends to be collectivist. So in the United States, you've got a vibrant civil society in which there are many, many strong religious groups, all pursuing their own ends and their churches and ideals. This does not produce what I think Ferenc was fearing, a disintegration of society, because everybody, well, not everybody, but by and large, and of course nothing's perfect, but by and large people can unite around the ideals which underlie the constitution and formation of the United States, which is based, I would say, basically a Christian view, but that doesn't, in a sense that doesn't matter, but based on an idea of the dignity of the individual and of all individuals being free to pursue their own ends within the law, obviously. And this does not in any way militate against a strong sense of religion or of community, but without the state imposing any simple, comprehensive ideal on everybody. Obviously, people like, well, I don't know what Rawls would say. Rawls would probably agree that I would say that to go back slightly deeper, and I'm not really a historian, but this does have deep roots in Christianity, in fact, because, and this allows me to give a partial reply to some of the things that Ferenc said, because I think that the idea of individual freedom and the workings of grace on the individual are two things which are absolutely central to Christianity and does distinguish it from, say, Islam or Judaism. The whole emphasis on Christianity is that we are each free and subject to the workings of grace, which we also require, but we have to work out our own salvation, and we can't rely on the collective. And I think that idea of individuals working out their own salvation is also powerful within the mentality of the United States.
And tradition. Given that, now let me say this. One is that, again, history is important, I think. That if we regard the constitutional arrangement in the US, what we have to realize that it's, greenfield project. It's not something that is brought out of hundreds of years of guilt and bloodshed, but it's a relatively new, modern project, so to say, and therefore some of the dangers that were confronted with in the old world could be avoided. I don't say that everything, but some of them, and that was quite good for that particular country. The other one is this, that I agree with Anthony that indeed the Christian origins of the country is important, and within the Christian culture, I think that Protestantism is the kind of Christianity that one needs to take into account, and there you have a different sort of relationship between the community and God than in the Catholic tradition. And in that sense, it makes it possible for this sort of separation between the church and state easier than in the Catholic context. But even so, I think that even today, what we see in the US is a cultural war. So there is no such harmony that we, as admirers of the American institutions, would suppose, but rather very excited and hot and politically motivated debates, for example, about the decisions of the Supreme Court. How far do they follow partisan lines instead of taking the commonly accepted kind of basics of the Constitution? So I don't think that in a pluralistic society one can suspect that there is a harmony of this. But I agree with both of you that comparatively speaking, it's still something that Central Europe should learn from.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I'm Sándor Kerekes, but a humble journalist. And because of time restraints, I may be a little bit crude in my assessments. So morality and ethics, especially in school, the Christian morality and ethics had quite a bit of long tradition of being compromised, and I wouldn't regard it as an ideal source of morality, especially not when it comes to children, and if there is any elaboration would be needed in the last 50, 60 or 100 years of history, I would be perfectly happy to provide it, but I am sure it is not necessary. I would rather wonder, why is it that, especially in the late developments in science and technology, religion, and especially the Catholic Church, is always ready to oppose it, always ready to act as a kind of an impediment instead of joining the process? So is it any wonder that society is becoming quite impatient with religious and particularly fundamentalist opposition? Now, in view of what I just said about the moral tradition of the Church, and churches in some cases, why would it be suitable as a mitigator of society's activities? Why would we call on a church to tell us what the right morality is when we already know that it is a somewhat disreputable source of such things? I also wonder, why are you calling...
Third question, I think.
Well, is there a limit on the number of questions?
A conservative liberalism applies here.
Each of them are extremely short on its own, as you must admit. Is there such a thing as strident secularism, or is there secularism that isn't strident? Everybody who is not secularist calls secularism strident at the moment it crops its head up. I don't think it's fair. But you know what, I am going to throw away the other 50 questions, and I am remaining with the last one. The Catholic tradition of Europe. I think this is a false misrepresentation. The pagan, the Greco-Roman tradition of Europe is much longer than the Christian one. And claiming that Europe must be Christian just because there are a few 100 years, 2,000 years tradition of Christianity is a distortion not only of the facts, but also of the history. It's not necessary. And claiming on this ground, wouldn't you think, there is no reason to import a religiously inspired morality or politics into Europe, which is clearly running to the opposite direction.
And I would have enjoyed a lot more of that, but for the moment, let me try to answer these ones the following way. I think that there is indeed a false presupposition behind the questions. It looks to me that if we argue for a Catholic tradition in Europe, then we are arguing against some other traditions in Europe, which is not the case. So I think that there is no contradiction here that you imply, between a supposed Greco-Roman alternative, a secularist alternative, and a religious alternative. I think all the three are European. And why should we deny that? Why should not we live with that peacefully? I mean, is that not part of Europe? Was there no such thing as Christianity in Europe? Why to question that? I don't see the point. Only if we want to let them, compete with each other. I think it's not a competition. It's part of our history. All the three of them. We were Greco-Roman and Christian and secularist.
I'm not sure how much those questions were directed at me, but I would just point out that, to go back to Dante again, Dante thought that the donation of Constantine was one of the worst things that happened in the history of the church. When the church became identified with of course it was actually a forgery, but that wasn't what was believed in the Middle Ages. That was when the church became identified with the power of the Roman Empire, and in my opinion, became deeply corrupted thereby. And I agree with Dante. So if that's your question, then probably I would agree with you. And I of course, the church has indulged in terrible abuse of power. But that still doesn't mean that there isn't at the heart of it deep truths that we all need to come to terms with, like original sin and the need for grace, which I believe profoundly and would express in all sorts of ways. I also want to say, I just can't resist replying to something that Ferenc said. The United States was not a greenfield invention. It actually came from centuries of English argument and institutions which were transposed to the New World. And of course, when the revolutionaries claimed independence, what they were doing, and I would have done the same had I been in their position, they were claiming the rights of free-born Englishmen. So they weren't inventing things out of nothing, even though Jefferson may occasionally have made it appear as though they were. It actually came from a long tradition of thought and, more important, practice, and also the idea that the common law, which again goes against the sort of collectivism that maybe we find in Europe, that the law doesn't come as imposed from above. It emerges through the dealings of people, individual people and groups of individual people. And that's a law that has will have much stronger roots than something that's simply imposed from above by the collective. The collective also is always captured by self-interested groups. And that's not a criticism of them, because once you've got a collective, that's what you have to do. But I want to do away with it.
I think
yeah.
Ferenc, you want to come back.
Yes, on these 2 points. One about the greenfield thing. Yes, you are right. I was not correct in saying that it's out of the blue as far as the ideas are concerned, as far as the traditional experience is concerned that was brought over to the Americas. But what I claim is that there was no society there and not social conflicts there that were inherited. That the society itself was indeed a new phenomenon there, without the aristocracy, without the established church, at least in some of the states. So it means that there is a new society there that will be able to do that. Just imagine the same sort of experiment under Habsburg rule. Can you possibly imagine something happening like that? I mean, there is here a different historical context, and one should, at least that is one of the experiences that we learn in Hungary and in Central Europe generally, that we have to take into account history. History is a heavy burden on us.
Thank you. Another question? Well, I have one question myself, addressed to Anthony, but Ferenc might like to come into it. Anthony, you outlined, to me very plausibly, a political philosophy in which the state not only allows the common sense maximum of liberty to individuals and groups, but also promises to protect them against each other when they find their views odious or false. Now, the example which you yourself said was the clearest one, I think, was the case in which the state has recently prohibited, has compelled religious adoption groups to promote same-sex adoptions by same-sex couples, even though that's available already through non-religious adoption groups. And my question is this. I can see perfectly that your argument there is a liberal argument, and yet the opposite side in that debate was taken by people who undoubtedly considered themselves the representatives of liberalism in the British political system at the moment. They were one of the parties, in fact, has the name, which would have fought this most vigorously on the other side, has the name of liberal in it. Now, if they're not liberal, but they think they are, what are they? And what is the political tradition that they are advancing even without realizing it?
Well, I mean, they're not liberal in the sense that you and I were using the term. What they're trying to do is to impose their own comprehensive view of how things should be in the moral, and what I would say is actually a private moral sphere on everybody. And if they were in the tradition of, let's say, Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, and by the way, I don't think John Stuart Mill is right on everything. I just think people ought to read him because he does actually spell out some of the implications of liberalism. Then they would see that they're not liberal. These same people also want everything decided, if not by central government, by local councils, which again is just a way of small groups of people, in the case of local councils, very small groups of people, imposing their will on everybody else. They have no right to the term liberal, but I'm not worried about the term. I mean, let's use other terms. What I'm worried about is the attitude of mind that this presents, and it's an attitude of unacceptable bossiness and collectivism.
Yes, shortly, I'm sorry to be interested in the topic, but it really fascinates me. One is this, the distinction between two kinds of liberalism that needs to be differentiated, I think. And that is between classical liberalism and what I would call modern liberalism. And I think that the difference is this. Classical liberalism is only about the rights of the individual as opposed to powers any sort, be it secular or sacred. It should be, there is a private sphere that is defended by that sort of liberalism. There is another one, which is a more partisan type, which has an agenda and a comprehensive view, as one can claim, and that wants to get its program through regardless of the rights of the individuals in some cases. So in that sense, it's a liberalism against the classical liberal position. As far as Mill is concerned, of course, we should read it, and I try to teach them to our students. But let's be clear about it. He was a romantic individualist. And a romantic individualist who had some sorts of ideas and hopes that did not come through. And I think that we should also read some others of the British tradition, including people like Edmund Burke, who refer to another part of the British tradition, and a part without which the nice scenario of the independent person, community within a liberal state could not come true, and that is the idea that we should cherish our traditions, that we should defend our institutions that we inherited from our forefathers, like the family, like the church, and that there is a need for not collectivism. I think that the opposite of the individual is not the collective. It's rather a communal identity that one requires if one wants to live a fulfilled life. And I think that one of the problems John Stuart Mill had to confront was that he was without that sort of community in some respects.
Could I just make one comment on that? Burke was horrified by collectivism, as everybody knows.
Yes, I am.
Yes. And Burke did not want a big state. Burke wanted autonomous institutions and little platoons. And if you read Burke, what he shows is that you can have a sense of community, which I'm up to a point in favor of, though can get a bit oppressive. You can have a sense of community without having everything directed by the state or local bureaucrats, which is actually the option that we're given. What I think the situation we've now come to in England, I wouldn't, of course, say anything about, I don't know anything about Hungary in this respect, but the situation we've come to in England is that people who cherish traditions, the traditions which were dear to Burke, like the family and the church, possibly the army too, the law, as autonomous institutions, will now only find protection for the autonomy that they're looking for within a kind of broadly million type of state, one in which the state does have as its first aim the protection of liberties under security and order. And I think that's the situation that we're in. So in fact, there is a convergence at that point, but partly because the liberals that apparently we're all against, that is the liberals of the Liberal Party, they are the people who are attacking the traditions that probably both Ferenc and I think will keep a community together.
Thank you. I want to just come back on one point and then ask for a final question, and that is in the kind of state, liberal state that you favor, Anthony, is there, in which religions are protected, but in which no religion has a monopoly of power, is there a scope or role for the law and practice to recognize that a particular culture, in this case, of course, it would be a Christian culture, is in some sense privileged over other cultures when making legal decisions or other political decisions?
I think that there could be. I would actually put it more negatively and say that the law must be very careful not to allow other religions that would undermine those liberties to act in a way to undermine them, even below the radar, which is what is happening.
Thank you. I don't see another hand raised, so I do see a hand raised, this gentleman here.
a thought to my mind as I was hearing the conversation. Do the professors see any connection of the technology advancement, like the devices I have in my hand here, an influence on the idea of liberty versus democracy, and then the state trying to control everybody, that sort of context, how that develop? Do you think there's a strong technology effect in that, or it has any particular effect on that?
Well, of course, I know nothing about social media except that they exist. I wouldn't touch them with a barge pole. However, I think what is true is that the technologies which, of course, everybody takes for granted now, you know, obviously we can go back to newspapers, telephones, telegraph, television, then all these more modern things. They both allow more freedom, they allow more knowledge, but equally they allow more control. So you know, I don't think in themselves they're either good or bad. It depends what use is made of them. I think in the case of the Eastern Bloc, and you would know much more about it than I do, I think actually being able to pick up Radio Free Europe and watch West German television probably had quite a big, you know, West German television is probably absolutely appalling, but being able to watch it probably had quite a good, because all television is appalling, but it probably had good effects on people's mentality in Czech, I know, in the Czech Republic probably, or Czechoslovakia, probably here, Poland, you know, because people could just see that there was another way of life, not you know, only miles away, kilometers away, sorry. But equally, no doubt the state television here was using it to impose a dogmatic oppression. So there you have it. There you have both the good and the bad.
I think, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the session. It's been this meeting. It's been an extremely lively and fruitful one. I'm grateful to both our speakers. I want to just make a short announcement that Professor here will be speaking again tomorrow in Pest, but on Thursday in which college, Kalman? Oh, okay, well, we will announce that. And this time that his speech will be on the topic, he is an expert among other areas in the philosophy of science, and this will be an address looking at the scientific philosophies of Popper and Imre Lakatos. So,
And global warming.
and the topic, and yes, as illustrated in global warming, precautionary principles, and so on. So I think that's going to be a fascinating occasion and a very lively one. We ask you to look out on the website for the exact address. And I want to thank him, and I want to thank Professor Horscher. It was a terrifically interesting presentation on both sides. I think we've had a fairly good debate. I would like to ask you to join me in thanking them.